now I can finish.
The trouble with chairing a conference is that one is responsible for the timetable, and we still have a program ahead of us. So I had to press the speaker to cut a fascinating talk short. But I do believe that Dov will be available after the panel to answer the very important question. For those of you who notice that people live a lot longer in Israel than they live in the United States, the question is, if you work in the United States and retire in Israel, do you still benefit? I'd like to invite Michal and Michael up to the panel so we can have a question and answer session on these papers. And after the question and answer, there will be coffee and cookies in the back, and then we complete the program with a concluding lecture, a single concluding lecture, an overview lecture. All right, questions? Dr. Zalashik.
It's a question for Professor Shalev. The group which you...
Speak loudly.
The group which awakened my curiosity the most were the immigrants from the former Soviet Union. I didn't write down exactly the data, but it was not very consistent. I mean, their economic worries and their support for the protests, etc. That's only one example. If you can say something about this group, is it like still leftovers of what they would call Homo sapiens, or what is going on with this group?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have really good answers. I can tell you that what comes out of our analysis, as we saw, is that the relative economic position of young people who were born in the Soviet Union has improved at the same time as the relative economic position of young families headed by veteran Israelis has been declining. This suggests that they started from a much lower position, and they have had the education, many of them, and the drive to do better and to overcome disadvantage, and have actually been relatively successful in that respect. The politics of it are somewhat complex because the Russian tribe in Israel has, like the other tribes, its own internal culture, mass media, and opinion-making processes, and they were uniformly hostile to the social protests. They regarded them in some respects correctly as being a program led by activists from the political left, and they tend to be suspicious of anything that might have a tinge of socialism, egalitarianism. These are kind of dirty words for many people who came out of the former Soviet Union. In another survey that I did, which is not a representative one, but based on people who filled in a questionnaire on a website, 3,000 Israelis who did so after the September 3rd demonstrations, we found that there was a significant number of young people from the former Soviet Union who were quite active in the social protest movement, and it's clear that there's internal differentiation in both their economic situation and, more significantly for that, their political outlook, which the data that I presented in my talk can't address. And really this requires much deeper research, which I haven't done, and would be happy if anybody wants to volunteer to do.
Okay, yes, Eyal.
I have a comment on something that Michael presented. I think you said that 95% of the people supported the protest or supported socialism in some sense. And I think what these people were supporting is some redistribution, but not from themselves to others. If you ask people, are you willing to contribute for a more egalitarian society? I don't know if you get that much of a response. I think most people were thinking like, okay, I'm in favor of lower military spending, or I'm in favor of lower support for the settlement or for priorities should change, but not necessarily from themselves to others. And I think perhaps this is why and I'm coming back to the question that were asked in the previous in the morning session, how come the organizers of the protest did not want to associate themselves politically is simply because of that, because the fact that they did not associate themselves politically allowed so many people to be in favor of the protest. So I wonder if you have anything on that.
Yeah, as I tried to emphasize, I think that attitudes towards redistribution are very self-interested, always. And we do know, for instance, that when we ask questions in surveys, and we ask whether people are in favor of government closing income gaps, many more people will say yes if there's no qualification which says, and would you be ready to pay more taxes? But on the other hand, even if you ask and include the qualification of being ready to pay more taxes, Israelis are still more in favor than other groups. So I stand by my claim that egalitarianism has strong foundations in Israel, not for the usual reason that's given, because of Israel's socialist past. I'm very skeptical about Israel's socialist past, but Israel had a very strongly collectivist past, and it has many strong forces that push the Jews of Israel towards collectivism. As for the non-political, I don't think I agree with the direction you were going in. I think I tried to argue that the apolitical and non-political position of the leadership and the supporters of the social movement actually reflects two things. One I didn't talk about. One is utter disgust with politics. Okay, this is something which is also common to the Spanish social protests and many others. We have a political system which people do not believe in. This is not unique to Israel, I should emphasize, and it won't change by some tinkering with the system either, but that's another discussion. And then we have the strategic sophistication of the leaders of the social protest movement who didn't want to have their efforts to raise the issue of more government intervention to close inequalities and support the middle class. They didn't want that to be wrecked politically by raising all the specters of conflict between Haredim and secular, conflict between left and right. Exactly the conflicts which I showed were under the surface of support, different levels of support for the protest. In fact, they were walking a very thin line. So they didn't believe in the political system, but they also were being strategic in being non-political.
Yes.
Okay, this is actually more of a holdover from the last panel, but it's still applicable to this panel. What is the size, and has it been growing, of the underground economy or the informal economy of Israel, which no one's really discussed, and I assume is a pretty large component of the minority population. Was it part of the first?
It'll be addressed in the last paper. Okay. We're keeping something for the end. Henriette.
Okay, thank you again for the talks. I want to contest one terminology, and that is the terminology of protest. I would call it, of course, from my point of view, the protest deluxe. Protest deluxe in the sense that the young protesting people knew exactly what they want, unlike what was suggested here, but they knew how to term it in universal and consensual terminology, which is social justice. They wanted wages, more jobs, etc., and so forth. And I think this is the same in the United States, because it's a middle class. In this respect, they did not contest the legitimacy of the state, but the legitimacy of the ongoing policy. Unlike but they don't want the current policy. And therefore, my understanding of the situation is unlike in the past. For example, take the Black Panthers in Israel. The Black Panthers in Israel say that they don't want this is an unjust state, and therefore it is delegitimate or unlegitimate. And what happened here was that, yes, it's our state, it is legitimate, we want it. What we don't want is the current policy. So that's, to my understanding, we're talking about the generation who learned how to formulate its demands in more universalized terminology, but actually what they wanted are very concrete things for the middle class people. This also explains why the lower class did not join them in August, but only in July, as you showed in the chart, and the trust in the protest declined. So I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Maybe some of my colleagues would also like to respond to that.
Go ahead. I can make a statement about the interns, but go ahead, Mike.
Well, I actually see less difference between the Black Panthers and there's a major difference, which is that this is a group of people who feel like outsiders, but they are nowhere near as marginalized as the groups that the Black Panthers claim to represent were. But I think the sense that this is our state and we're not getting a fair piece of the pie was very much present in the Black Panther movement as it was. When you say they delegitimized the state, I don't think they did at all. I think that what they were angry about was that they weren't getting a fair share of the pie as political activists, as citizens. They were contributing, they were ready to do their military service, they were not getting a fair share of the pie. And I think that's, in a way, the same sentiment as drove the social protest movement. I also think, I don't really agree that the protesters, and I include here the masses of parents who joined the protests. We keep emphasizing the young people who were the vanguard, but anybody who was in the streets of Tel Aviv during those protests knows that the parents were also there, and also the generation behind the younger people. And the issue was not...
also the clerks, of course, those who made the policies, so I think you have
Sure,
to be
exactly.
balanced.
Exactly, sure. So either we say, well, this is false consciousness. Why are really affluent, well-heeled Tel Avivians, demanding social justice? Or we recognize that there is an issue here which has to do with being in the center of society and politics. The sense that this is our country and our state, but we're not at the center. And I think that sense was very, very strong in the social protest movement, and that's what brought a lot of affluent, middle-class, older generation people who seemingly had no interest in the economic grievances, because they felt that this is not our government, this is not our people, and here we have a new mission for Israel. Peace and privatization didn't work. Social justice always has and will. And we are the bearers of that mission. And we feel good coming together and bearing that mission. And it's not that different in analytical terms to, I think, the story that you were telling.
Well, I think what happened in the medical case, in the case of the strike that we had as physicians, is really consistent with your argument. Basically, the young interns stayed out because they thought that the Israeli Medical Association or the fathers or the leadership or the establishment will deliver, okay? And then what happened is that the establishment, the Israeli Medical Association, signed an agreement with the government that they utterly didn't like, and I personally think rightfully so. And then they took the street. And that, I think, was a bit symptomatic in the sense that the young generation didn't feel that the older generation can deliver what they need, which turned out to be the case. And of course, but they agreed that the system should stay as it is. In other words, they didn't revolt against the system, they revolted against their leadership, against the system of doing business. And that it was a very interesting experiment, I think, in this regard.
Professor Ludomirski. Oh, I'm sorry, Michal.
The comparison you do with the Arab Spring is interesting, and I think it can also take us to the merits and limitations of social protest, because in one way you say the younger generation or this protest generation was more effective in reframing its demand in a consensus way that was, able to bring more people together under the umbrella of the social justice movement. On the other hand, if we look at and if we compare it to the effectiveness, and then we see an interesting picture, because in the Arabs, when we go to Egypt or Tunisia, we see on the one hand that social protest has this major effect because it led to the destruction of regimes. However, I'm not so sure if there is a clear path. While it brought to the collapse of a regime, but it's not clear how it brings in democracy or social policy and the interests of the groups that protested into government. And in Israel, while we get some interesting responses, like the creation of committees, discussions about social priorities, so we have already, well, we see that there is this effectiveness on the one hand, but yes, it's still really unclear if it can translate into a long-run impact on the development of social policy in recent years. If it's something that is just, takes part till the masses are out in the street, and when they go back, can this momentum have any continuance? And what are the mechanisms that translate this mass interest into actual social policy change? And I think this is where the big challenge is, and I think where also our role, if there is some role for scholars of social policy, then I think it's also here in showing how those interests were translated in the past, what happened to that they were overcome by other interests, and if at all there is a chance to represent them again.
We have time just for two more questions, Professor Ludomirski and Professor Rabinovich.
I was a physician that participated in the hunger strike in 1984.
A physician? Yeah, that's right. I remember it.
So I was in Tiberias. Didn't help there, and didn't help too much now. I have a question for you. There's a lot, the cost of medical expenditure will go up, and we try to do cost containment and cost control and so on and so forth. But I look at it, we're going to reach in Israel a point that the amount of physicians per 1,000 citizens will be less than 3 very quickly. And I think Israel, like a lot of miracles, were able to overcome this gap by the huge immigration of physicians from Russia in the 80s and 90s. Now when these physicians are retiring,
Right.
we are facing a major problem. And I don't think that opening of the new medical school in Tzfat, that personally I think it's a big mistake, instead of really enlarging the current medical schools and really allowing more Israelis across the ethical border, ethical social layers to go to medical school. Now you identify a small population in Tzfat that, as you showed, doesn't have a lot of physicians anyway, so I don't know where these people are going to get their education and so on and so forth. So what's the plan of Israel? How are they going to overcome this problem?
Well, you, I think, touch on a few issues. Let me try to be very brief. First of all, the idea of a medical school, I don't think is going to, I agree with you, is not going to resolve the issue of the number of physicians in Israel in any substantial way, definitely not in the short run. One of the basic ideas with the medical schools in the periphery is that they attract physicians. I mean, that was the idea with the medical school in Beersheba, that at the time was definitely not needed. but that was the only way to get really good physicians into the system, and that's very common. So that's one issue. So you have to be very, careful with what you're trying to achieve with a new medical school. The other issue is if you can attract physicians from overseas, to bring Israelis back to Israel who study in Hungary and in Italy and whatnot, why not? I mean, let's face it. I mean, it pays off in any possible way. But I think the key issue, the key challenge is that we should create a system that can adapt to a lower number of physicians. I think if the US can work with fewer physicians, technically I'm talking in terms of technology, and with fewer beds, and so England and so Germany, we should be able to do the same. And I think we don't have a flexible enough system, and that was one of the points I didn't get to. We don't have a flexible enough system that allows for that. We are still stuck with these ratios between physicians and beds to population and whatnot. And we have developed a very rigid system, and we actually, I think, became addicted to high numbers of physicians and resources. And we have to get off that.
Professor Rabinovich.
Couldn't have put it better.
Wonderful. And on that positive tone, and that positive note, I will point out, I'll say two things about the conference. This is the first scholarly conference I've been to where the audience has grown rather than shrunk, which is, I think, a lot for our speakers. And when this conference was conceived, normally conferences on Israel studies held at United States universities are about diplomacy and foreign policy and the peace process and so on. And one can always anticipate protest and politics around the conference. And I thought a conference on social policy is wonderful. We'll have a calm policy. We won't deal with politics at all. Little did I know, this is where politics is. So there is now coffee available, and we will reconvene in 20 minutes.